Good evening. My name is Fesse Longe, and I am the moderator for the Black Doctoral Network weekly web series entitled Conversation Starters, where we discuss various topics that are relevant within our community. And this week's topic I am excited to present to you all today is focused on parental involvement in educational success. Today, we have some wonderful scholars that will be joining us in our conversation this evening, and I will go ahead and introduce them. The first panelist that we have joining us today is Ms. Chantel Peinado Rogers, who is a professor at Keene University and is currently working on her PhD in Human and Social Services at Walden University with her research interest in blended family research. I thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Our second panelist we'll have joining us today is Dr. Donald Garner, who has a PhD in social work from Fordham University. He's currently part of the ministerial staff at Greater Allen AME Cathedral of New York. He's also the founder and consultant for Clark and Garner LLC, which is an educational consultant and research firm. And his research interests focus on prison reentry and Black and Brown male achievement. I welcome you, Dr. Garner.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and our third panelist that we have joining us this evening is Dr. Michael Flanagan, who is the director of Caribbean Research Center in Medgar Evers College City, University of New York. He currently has a PhD in higher education, leadership, and policy from Seton Hall University. His research interests focus on disparities in higher education, as well as social and racial inequalities. I welcome you, Dr. Flanagan. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I want to just go ahead and jump into this evening's topic of parental involvement with regard to educational success. And I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question here is, why do you think that it's critical for parents to be involved in their child's educational success? And I will go ahead and get started with Ms. Peinado Rogers.
So coming from the background that I'm from, I am from a Caribbean descent. We're the first generation here. And it's something that we were spoken to when we were young, how important it is to be, actively involved in school. A lot of the things that I have learned from my parents, I now have, instilled in my children. And one of them that's, out of the top three things is very much so education. And always putting your best foot forward in education. Your subjects in school are, we were told by our parents, you make sure you do your very, very best. Education will bring you a long way. So I think it's one of those things that is very important to push them along from a young age. And I mean, one of those things, the saying says practice makes perfect. I think if they start young and they understand the importance of it, as they get older, it becomes something that's naturally involved while they're in college, especially when, while you're in coursework, you're not as sitting in front of your professor for 8 periods a day. You'll understand the more important part of going to class, attending, getting good grades, not just, and paying attention in class. So I think those values that were instilled in me now translates into my adult life with my own children.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Dr. Garner, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so as we were sharing, Ms. Rogers, I was thinking about how long I'll say it differently. The educational process is a journey, right? And so when we are thinking about what needs to instill and impart, values into, small children until they get, to be of age and graduated from high school, that level of delayed gratification, is already an arduous task, right? To make a child understand the value of something delayed. So when I think about, why, and the role of parents. Parents to me, serve as that critical first cheerleader, right? That's going to, be on the journey, that very lengthy journey, with their children about what is required, stay in the game. I know it's hard, like all of those narratives and messaging that needs to be, given to the child is exactly why parents are very critical in that process.
Okay, wonderful. Dr. Flanagan, what about yourself? Don't think we can hear you.
Yeah, it's great to build on what both doctors, because I'm going to call my friend and from when first a doctor, just said. And one of the things that and I'm going to speak a lot to the literature and then come back and touch a little bit on what's happening now. All the literature tells you that parental involvement is a key driver in how well a child performs in terms of their educational aspirations, familiarity with academics, and their level of achievement. Interesting thing is, although parents in general, right, the relationship between parents and their school, the contact that they initiate with school, is very positive in terms of how it impacts the performance of children. The relationship is actually stronger for African Americans than it is for high school graduates of other racial and ethnic clusters. And the third point I want to make is that research has also indicated that parental involvement is positively correlated with reduced truancy rates and also improved self-assurance. And just to touch on the current scenario, it takes on critical and I get extra critical importance because recent data shows that as this semester, the fall semester, get into full swing with the COVID situation, there is actually a decline in the enrollment, right? So there's some 100,000 fewer high school seniors completing FAFSA, financial aid applications, which is an indicator that a lot of low income and low income and moderate income students of color primarily are being impacted in that way by the pandemic. And now, I'll just leave the rest for the other questions as we go on.
Okay, no, thank you for referring to the literature and providing us with the current statistics and data that really brings this topic to light, to understanding of how much an impact parental involvement is with regard to educational success. So the next question that I have for you all is, the school to prison pipeline is a phenomenon often associated with the discussion of academic success. How do you think race impacts this? I'll go ahead and start with Dr. Garner.
So when I think about the relationship between academic achievement and the school to prison pipeline, it reminds me of back in 2005 after graduating from Florida State University, I had the opportunity to work as a educational consultant for the Florida Department of Education, and I was doing a lot of work in the area of dropout prevention throughout the state of Florida, working with low performing schools. And then maybe the year after I got hired, I started doing a lot of consulting with school districts around parental engagement. So at 22 years of age, I was being exposed to, the literature and then and the practical, application of seeing the school to prison pipeline, in full effect, right? And so when I think about, this phenomena, the first word that comes up, and I'll save it for the rest of the panelists, is equity, right? So when it comes down to race, we know that people of color are disproportionately excluded from quality resources that are required for them to propel along the opportunity pipeline, right? That would make them successful in school. So again, not taking it away from the rest of my panelists, because I know they have a lot to weigh in on. So the first word that comes to mind is equity, and I think there's some disparities when we think about race and how there is a lack of equity that is provided to children of color, in particular when it comes down to education and academic success.
Okay. Yes, definitely. Ms. Leonardo Rogers, what are your thoughts?
I would have to agree. That was one of the things when I thought about, and the word phenomenon. What is it? In the state that I live in, certain areas, certain the educational system is structured differently in our urban areas, in our urban cities and towns, and when you see the steps and the growth that can happen in different areas, you begin to see how it is, that the school to prison pipeline can be, especially when it comes into
Oh, okay. I think we may have lost her for a second, but I'll go ahead and have Dr. Flanagan. I don't know if you could
Sure. Yeah.
follow up with that.
Yeah. So as Dr. Garner said before, I'll start at the very top and say that it's a purposeful contribution to the prison industrial complex. And what I mean by that is, we've heard this for many years that prison construction, prison development, as planning goes into that area and that industry. Um, Generally, what's one of the key statistics that's used in that calculus is the number of Black and Brown students in fourth grade. So as early as that, right? And so when we talk school to prison pipeline, it unfortunately it is the idea that schools are instrumental in not only pushing kids out of schools but pushing them into prisons by criminalizing behavior. So most of the kids who are entering the juvenile system are African American males. So the last data we have in this, at least that I found, was in 2015, over 48,000 youths were in the juvenile justice facilities across awaiting an hearing in juvenile or criminal court. So that's just one aspect. The other really sad part and disastrous part is that when they re-enter communities, they find it hard to reintegrate because the services are not there to support reintegration, right? So these include services for mental health, physical or sexual abuse, and also a public school system that I think Dr. Rogers was just touching on, that is perceived as being hostile to them. So again, the data is an approximate 44% return to school, and 56% are either turned away or simply drop out. And then a large proportion also return to the juvenile justice system. So it's an ongoing pandemic in itself that requires a lot of attention. And I know we'll get into that in the questions further on in this discussion. So I'll just stop at this point.
Interesting that you talked about more so the criminalization of youth within the educational system. That actually leads me to the next question that I have here, which is, what do you think are the reasons for the increase in suspensions, expulsions, and school-based arrest of Black students in schools across the country? I'll go ahead and start with Dr. Garner for that.
Yeah, that's definitely a loaded question. I believe that. So when I was a sociology major in undergrad, and one of my favorite professors, Dr. Reynolds, he allowed me to do a research project around summer inequalities, among African American students. And that was the first time that I was exposed to, critical literature around Pierre Bourdieu, around the capital framework. And that's when I learned about terms called tracking, where there was a systematic approach, that put African American students in, special education classrooms compared to gifted classrooms. It was also, in this, opportunity that I had with him that I learned about a book called The Trouble with Black Boys.
Mhm.
And the author's name is escaping me. But I learned about, the fact that African American students, well, I learned in that particular opportunity that, white female teachers, were the vast representation of who African American students are interfacing with on a daily basis, right? So that is a matter of a cultural collision, right? And so I think that a big part of what we see in terms of the school to prison pipeline being in effect is a matter of culture, right? There and has always been a cultural war when it comes down to values and norms, that are more valued than other norms and values. So I think schools in and of themselves represent middle class norms and values, right? So if you don't come from that particular background, if you don't have the language, if you don't have the social acumen that represent who is largely in charge, that can be a factor, right? The other piece that I think is so key, I'm looking down here at my notes in terms of some of the reasons why we're seeing, so many expulsions, suspensions and school-based arrests. I believe it's a matter of, segregation, right? So when we just look at, segregation from a very basic perspective, right? This means that there are certain people, there are groups of people like people of color, black people in particular, who are disproportionately, placed in areas that have a higher level of policing, right? And so there are certain communities that are already predisposed, to the level of interaction with law enforcement and a lack of trust, right? And this notion that I have to have surveillance over your life, over your body. And so if you're living in that particular, community, Dr. Rogers and Dr. Flanagan, it's almost safe to assume that that type of behavior, that type of mentality will transmit into where you go to school at, right? And so a lot of those behaviors and thinking about our students are just carried over, into the everyday school space. And so I think that does continue to contribute as to why our boys, our girls, are expelled at higher rates than their white, Latino, Asian counterparts. In the summary, I would say it is a result of you know schools being replicated off of middle class norms. And then I would lastly say this is an issue also of geography and segregation as to why there are some students that are disproportionately expelled and suspended at higher rates, Black people in particular.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Thank you for Ms. Pineda Rogers for joining us again. But I just wanted to catch you up to speed with regard to the question that we're exploring currently is, what do you think are the reasons for the increase in suspensions, expulsions, and school-based arrests of Black students in schools across the country? What are your thoughts with regard to that?
So sorry about that earlier. I have no idea what happened. That's never happened when you're working with technology. I guess anything is liable to happen. So the question, I agree with Dr. Garner on several different levels. And one of the things that I thought about, even in seeing this question, is when you're thinking in regards to suspension. So I also have a background in DCF with children and families. I've worked there for 15 years for my state and love it. And one of the biggest parts, especially with a lot of our young people, it's when we're talking about our topic tonight, parental involvement, parents not being involved, it translates generationally a lot of times. And I was that social worker for years that would speak to my clientele and let them know you can be the one that can change your generation. You can generational cursing of not having an education, not understanding the importance of it. You can be the one that can change that narrative. And I've spoken to them, I've encouraged, and when you help one out of so many, it feels so rewarding. But I know that one of the things is if your parents are not as involved in your educational means, and then you're in foster homes, to change that narrative is not easy for them, because going to school and the lack of schooling and being consistent in school cause several different hiccups across the board. So, once they get to a foster home and a foster parent is like, you can do this, it's like they're so overwhelmed and they begin to run away. And one of the reasons why is because they're so used to leaving school, going to find quick ways to get money, and they're following it without the parent that pushes them along, being their cheerleader. It's very hard for them to stay focused. So, they, after several 8 times, they get suspended. Then after missing another amount of days in this state of New Jersey, you're expelled from school, you're expelled. And then they have to figure out going to night school. And by then they're like, well, I could go get this fast money on over here. And they choose that narrative rather than staying in school, staying committed to education, moving along and changing the narrative for their generation, for their family, and I think that's one of the hardest things for our African-American, our urban areas, our students, to understand that they don't have to stay in that track. You can choose to have someone that pushes you and says, educationally, you can make it, and then there's other disparities that they think about in terms of, I can't never go to college, I'm going to owe the government all this money. And, they think of all the negatives instead of picking up the positives. So, I would say that would be the reason, because after so many times of being suspended from school, they're expelled. So that's one of the reasons, that the things that I would think in terms of that.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to reach out to our audience a little bit here. I'm inviting you all to go ahead and submit any type of comments or questions within the comment section, and we will definitely acknowledge them and highlight them throughout this web series. So Dr. Flanagan, what are your thoughts with regard to that question?
My thoughts. Dr. Garner, by the way, that author for that book is Pedro Noguero. Just for the audience, yeah. This question is so linked, like I said to you before, to all the questions that we have tonight. And one of the reasons I see, or a couple of the reasons, definitely institutional racism. I know that was touched on before, and zero tolerance policies. And one of the things I just also want to make a separation with is the aspect of middle class. So when we talk about middle class, we have to be make a distinct difference between white middle class and black middle class, because they're not the same. So a lot of black middle class are closer to low income blacks, or they're in every generation there actually is about a 30% recession back into the low income class. So I just want to make that distinction. They're not some of the services are not accessible and available to them. We know about the disparities in jobs and housing and salaries and so on. So again, one of the reasons that I also see that's critical is how and who controls what comes to a community. And this is where so timely both the census and voting are really, really important this year. And I hope everyone who is listening to this broadcast has completed their census and are also planning to vote, because that determines what comes to the community in terms of resources, not just money, but services. And so in a lot of cases, where the community is controlled by folks who do not look like us, but they're able to dictate legislation and policies or norms. They are the ones who ultimately shape how folks who look like us are treated. And so it's very important that we do that. Again, it goes right back to impacting health. It impacts policing. Some of this was talked about, I think, by Dr. Garner. And these are just some of the reasons that there are increased suspension, expulsions, and school-based arrests, because we're seen as, a lot of instances, students are seen as threats. There's not enough training, and we'll touch on those later on. And we just have to be vigilant as a people, vigilant as parents, vigilant as guardians, and vigilant in parent teachers associations, and vigilant in just the conversations we have, as Dr. Rogers said, the conversations we have with our children and even our larger village, from time to time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for answering that. I know, like you all said, very loaded question, and you all sharing all your insights. And I just wanted to highlight real quickly, Dr. Flanagan and Dr. Garner had mentioned, Dr. Pedro Noguero will be actually speaking at the Black Doctoral Network Conference this year. So if you all are, our audience members, are interested in hearing more of his thoughts and that phenomenon with regard to parental involvement in educational success, please definitely register for the conference this year, occurring in October. But to move on here, the next question that I have is, what do you think the role is of educators, parents, and community members in addressing the adverse impact of the school to prison pipeline? Go ahead and start with Dr. Garner.
So I'm going to hone in on, looking down at my notes. I'm going to hone in on, there was several groups that you mentioned. I think I'm going to do the community. I think that the community can definitely play a role in raising the profile, the concern, the conscientiousness of American society, that the school to prison pipeline, is still a very live and real phenomena. It's creating adverse, impacts on children of color. So I think the community, and that can be represented by our nonprofit organizations, most importantly, from my lens, the faith-based community, to really become, vocal, mouthpieces, if you will, watchdogs, if you will, for, parents and for our students who are, mostly affected. So I think that is definitely critical. And I think, in so doing, that then creates, and actually puts the attention on our policymakers, who are at the end of the day crafting legislation that are affecting our schools. If the community is speaking up, knocking on the doors, being the watchdogs, creating infrastructure that can, continue to monitor and not let these issues fall by the wayside, then the politicians and all the other, players who are responsible for, like I just said, crafting legislation, can be influenced, to create, positive, legislation and other strategies to help our children succeed and be on the, trajectory for success.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Pinata Rogers, what about you?
I guess since he decided to touch on the community, I'll go with the educators. I think being an educator at one of our universities here in the state, I think one of the best things that I can do is I have conversations with my students, but I think even with my own children, and when we again look at the topic for tonight, understanding parental involvement in that education, I think working alongside a lot of the teachers to, let them be very much aware of what the whole picture looks like, that whole picture, the school to prison pipeline is real, and the narrative is real. And a lot of times we tend to, especially in our African American cities and urban cities, we tend to not think in terms of that. We just think, okay, send our children to school. And especially now with COVID, you know, the educational system is changing. So, you know, if parents and teachers don't get on the same page, where educators can help to motivate parents, and parents, motivate their children, the reality of it is that it's real, and it can't, you know, that whole prison to school to prison pipeline can actually be negated. And the reality is that it's very, very real. So speaking to parents and letting them know how to keep their children in the school narrative and pushing them. You know, a lot of times, like, you know, even I think Dr. Flanagan mentioned, you know, being involved in PTO. I'm one of those parents for all three of my children, very active in PTO meetings and making sure that I hear what is being projected to my children. And on the flip side, as an educator, having those conversations, you know, with my students, even at a collegiate level, for them to still hear how important it is, not to fall off by the wayside, and how true it is for them to keep pushing. You know, I had a student tell me recently, like, you know, Dr. Rogers, you push us. And I said, absolutely, you can do this. If I'm doing it, you can do it. It's not, you know, and that those words sometimes, you know, just that positive reinforcement goes so far with our society. So I think that definitely as an educator, working alongside parents and those that don't have parents, still having a conversation just to give them that motivation to understand how important it is for your family, if you can, to get involved. And if they can't, just, you know, sitting with students. And that's why, you know, even before, when Dr. Flanagan said COVID is around, it's so hard now even to have those conversations with children, you know, with teachers. When your student is with you, normally that relationship that you build with them is not there anymore. Now they're in a home, and you know, if the parent is not on them about pushing through, you know, they can lose their way, and you know, the pipeline can change that quickly for them, you know. So I totally, you know, I believe that as educators, just working with families, working with the parents, finding ways to motivate them, it is a great way to let them understand that that pipeline is very real.
No, thank you. I really appreciate you providing that educator's perspective actively, so we can really conceptualize the reality of this topic. Dr. Flanagan, what are your thoughts? Your microphone is muted.
Oh, sorry. It's actually open. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So I would say you know, what Dr. Garner talked about it, awareness, and also being aware that the school to prison pipeline is alive and well, and also being aware of the benefits of professional development and training, particularly in cultural competency, right? So a lot of that, that's a major issue in terms of how our teachers see. And this is not even just racial sometimes, or ethnic sometimes. It also depends. I've spoken to parents and students who one particular student has spent a lot of time in Africa, and she was born in America. And when she came back, she was behaving from the cultural context of having grown up in Africa, right? So she wasn't very outspoken in class, and the teacher was giving her a hard time because she wasn't being as responsive, you know, putting her hand up as frequently as that, right? So it's things like that. Implicit bias, we touched on that before, just based on racial differences, and so that I see. The other thing that's very much important, I just want to touch this because I know it was talked about before. Who are the real community stakeholders, or who are the stakeholders actually? So we have all these community-based NGOs, we have the school districts, we have peer mentoring groups, we have mental health organizations, we have the churches, or I like to say houses of worship, professional associations, alternative schools, juvenile correction institutions, law enforcement, and national and state advocacy groups. So all of these have to be engaged, right, to make a difference, especially when we look at it from community members. So it really has to be everyone, and we've said this for vigilance is a key. We really don't have the luxury of taking a nap on this.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate you all providing different perspectives, and what I'm understanding from all of you is that there's a common theme here. Whether it be community, whether it be the educators or the parents, everybody needs to be involved. So each aspect within their context can really contribute with regard to that child being educated and dealing with the adverse effects of the school to prison pipeline. So the next question that I have here is, do you think that the educational system plays a role in influencing parents' involvement in their child's academic achievement? And I will go ahead and start with Dr. Penato Rogers.
I would definitely say that the school system plays that role in influencing parents. In today's society, if we are not involved in understanding that this is it's almost like a contractual agreement per se with our children. And I think from the parent standpoint, I have to entrust my children with this institution for 8 hours out of a day per se. Sometimes, 9 hours with, my daughter who is in a charter school that they do, college credits. I have to have that conversation with them. I have to know, what are you teaching? Specifically, what does the classroom look like? What is the amount of students? If my child is struggling in an area, what is the likelihood of her being able to sit down with her teacher or a tutor to give her that one-to-one conversation? And I do know that, in some of our, our towns and our neighboring cities, there are different struggles in even receiving a tutor. So when we talk about the actual, earlier, Dr. Garner and Dr. Flanagan also had, conversation regarding how different towns, across the board, educationally, those barriers are in our urban areas. So when it comes to our African-American children, I just believe it is so important that as parents, you entrust your children to go to this institution, having a conversation, see what they're being taught, sit with them, have that conversation so you know exactly what it is. And the schools have to do their due diligence to implement these tactics to say, let's have these moments of involvement, to have our parents to come out and see what we're doing. I know that there's research out there on it because I read it. For me to actually sit and quote Dr. Flanagan is shaking his head yes, that institutions have to have that push, that drive to allow, parents to come in to hear that. And a lot of times, parents feel like, when you have to have the demeanor that I can't enter my child's school freely to have a conversation. Be in touch with social workers. Social workers need to be, for schools, you're in touch with our children. If my son he's a senior this year, but every year of high school, there was a conversation. If my son was never spoken to by his social worker, I'm calling the social worker. Why hasn't my son had a conversation with you about his future? Those things are so important to push along, and those were the narratives, yes, given to me when I was younger, but it was just a matter of the school. If you don't hear from a parent, it shouldn't be, at report card time to have, and then to say, oh, I haven't heard from a parent. Reach out, do the due diligence. It goes a long way, because sometimes just reaching out to the parent is letting them know what's going on. But parents, we have to step up and do it as well. So absolutely, it is a very, very, very big role that educators actually, have to understand how to get parents involved in those educational needs.
I really appreciate that response for highlighting that the actual educational system needs to reach out as well. So it's actually some we would describe as a relationship that needs to be developed. Dr. Garner, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I believe that, Dr. Rogers definitely, eloquently described, what that contractual relationship should look like. I will further, what she just said by by giving just a small backdrop of my work. I mentioned earlier, when I was working at the Florida Department of Education as a consultant, and although I had just graduated from college, I was trained by a framework called the National Network of Partnering Schools. A researcher by the name of Joyce Epstein. Now, it was from a middle class white woman who had created this framework of how to engage in schools. And at the time, again, I was young. I didn't know how to research any other frameworks, at least at that time. But what she did have was enough for me at that time to learn how to engage in conversations with schools and particularly principals on what are you doing to create a culture that invites parents to be a part of the whole educational process. So, from that early stage of my career up until the present, I have spent a lot of time. I had a fortunate opportunity to, engage in with hundreds of principals and looking at, what they're, you know, I've had conversations and consultations with principals about their front office staff culture,
Mhm.
right? What are the initial touch points that when a parent walks into your school building, what are they experiencing, right? When they come to sign in, what does the book look like, right? What's the personality of, the secretary, and on and on and on, right? So I've done that level of, consultation where principals had to really be thoughtful, like, whoa, I'm not doing this, I'm doing this, and this is positive, this is negative, etc. So I think schools have to think about the culture that is inviting parents to come in the first place. And then before Dr. Flanagan, gets the floor, I think it's critical for um, schools to think about all types of parents, particularly our parents who are English language learners,
Mhm.
and other parents who are just historically marginalized from the educational process. So again, I think schools should have a framework, right? They should have a general idea of all the types of parents that are coming into their building and thinking about whether there's a customized strategy, for each group. So yeah, I think education schools rather have they play a major role in influencing, a child's educational outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Now, Dr. Flanagan, I've seen you've been agreeing with a lot of our panelists here. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I love when they say all this stuff. I agree because I just have to build on that. So, um, absolutely. So we have a number of factors that play into how well a student, particularly Black and Brown students, achieve. Right. One is counseling, and so we have the really disparate rate of counselors and their effectiveness depending on what school you're in. So if you're in a public school or you're in a charter school, um, in a charter school, the counselor, the ratio of students to counselors is much smaller. So where ideally it should be about, in a public school system, it probably should be 100 to 121. And I know Dr. Rogers can probably fix that for me, that number, but it's definitely not where it should be. It's probably about 200. And what's happening now, and if you think about particularly with COVID, counselors are being asked to do more functions, right? Teaching functions than ever before. So even before COVID, they were doing additional functions. Now that's multiplied. So that's definitely having a negative impact. One of the other things that's critical is how much a counselor and teacher and inspires or does not inspire a student, right? So we have examples of um, all across the board. I have spoken to parents. I've seen it in the literature where students, brown and black, are told, well, you really shouldn't think beyond maybe the state college or the city college, right? So don't think about Ivy League. Don't think about going to school out of state. And so we know also too culturally, right? In our demographics, a lot of students work and they work to support their families. So again, the school they're in, out of school, as Dr. Garner touched on, out of school interacts with parents, know what resources are available for these students. So these students don't have to think about, well, I have to leave school and go to work so I can help my family out. Or the family doesn't take it on themselves to tell the student, you need to work, you need to carry your load in this household, right? Things like that. And then the last point I'll touch on, which is very important, is what type of recommendation is a counselor giving to colleges for a student when they apply? And there have been instances, I've been told, by principals and assistant principals, and I don't know how much this is public, but I'm going to put it out there that sometimes the letter that the guidance counselor prepares, the parent may see and looks all glowing and positive, is not the actual letter that ends up going to a college, right? So just want to put that out there because we have to be very careful. We have to be aware of these things. And in a case like that, we want as a parent to go into the counselor and say, you give me that letter, I'll mail it. Okay. I'm just giving you bottom line, on the ground recommendation.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question that I want to go that actually builds upon that question is, in what ways do you believe race and gender can influence the relationship between parental involvement and educational success? I'll go ahead and start with Dr. Pinato Rogers.
So there are various ways, but I think that the main way that I would actually see based on race and gender would be based on values, whatever values are instilled from the family. Again, I go back to generation. If it wasn't of value for your education to be taught to you, it will be something hard, and you can definitely change the narrative. However, it's very hard to understand, to how to change it, to put that, be involved as a parent in your own child's educational success. So, I mean, I know in our African-American communities, education should start, with the parents teaching a child at home from their young, teaching them, different values and different, especially as we were raised, ladies are raised a certain way, males are raised a certain way, and then you move forward into values of once you turn 5 and now you're in preschool, what that education system looks like, or what the expectations of education system looks like based on your parents. That's one of the main ways that I would see is values, as a foundation. And I'm sure that Dr. Garner and Dr. Flanagan build on there, but I'll start off with the value system at home, because across the board, every culture, every race teaches that are differently, or I should say they're involved differently in their children's education. And I mean, I come from a town that we're very diverse, and how you would see the Asian parents with their children are totally different how you would see some of our African-American families with their children, as well as our Caucasian with parents with their children, totally different. And you'll see, even as far as not just the educational, but sports, being active, you see what parents show up at the football games, and you see what parents show up at the spelling bees. You definitely see it across the board. It depends on the values, absolutely.
Okay, no, definitely agree. Thank you for highlighting that. Dr. Garner, what are your thoughts?
So when I was looking at that question, and I was thinking about, again, race and gender. We know that, the relationship that when you factor race and gender into, education, it can be a very mixed, mixed understanding. It's very nuanced. It's very complicated, to say the least. And so one of the things that just struck out to me was, when race and gender is involved in terms of parent engagement, I think the word trauma, comes to mind, right? And I think a lot of the work that I've done at the high school level I had a nonprofit organization for a number of years in Tallahassee, Florida, and we had a year-round uh, college prep program called STEPS. And so that gave me an opportunity from like 22 to about 25 years of age to meet with parents throughout the entire school year. We had about 50 parents in this pilot project that we created. And what I noticed is that there was a lot of those parents who were traumatized, by their own educational experience, right? And because they had a relatively adverse relationship with teachers, with schools, some of them did not finish, some of them barely finished, and some actually, did go to college and so on and so forth. But for the most part, by and large, there was this strained relationship. And what I discerned, very early in my career, in my observations, was that those stressors, right, that trauma, obviously not obviously, it is a greater likelihood that trauma is transmitted, over into the narratives and the values as as was being lifted up to the children, to the child. And so I think when race and gender comes in play, it can complicate, the understanding of, how parents actually show up, when it comes to their child's education and what they think and how much energy, that they're even able to devote, to their child's trajectory as a whole. So yeah, the word trauma really comes to mind. And I think it's something that educators, practitioners should account for and be mindful of when they are thinking about what this, means for, parents and children to be, partners together, in the educational process.
Okay, thank you for highlighting that contextual factor. Like you said, the trauma does have an impact in regard to that relationship. Dr. Flanagan, what are your thoughts?
So, race and gender. For us, we know as a fact that there are more women in college right now in higher education. We also know, I see Dr. Rogers give me that smile. We also know that the statistics from a 2014 study shows that Black women are the most educated Black in America right now. Um, and so I just want to put that out there, but I also want to add to that because I wanted to dispel a lot of the negativity. That despite the stereotype that about African Americans, Black Americans in the United States today are among those most likely to earn a post-secondary degree. So according to the National Center for Education Statistics, from 2001 to 2015 to 2016, number of bachelor's degrees awarded to Black students increased by 75%, and the number of associate degrees earned by Black students increased by 110%. Now, it sounds great. I mean, we still have a long way to go, but it's a great trajectory. And so I start with that to kind of shape a context that also what Dr. Rogers touched on before. I think it's inherent in our DNA that we are serious. We're very much invested in education. I know as a child, I grew up with an aunt who just barely completed high school, but she always made sure I never missed school. I don't care if I missed a day of school. She probably couldn't tell you why, but she just knew at the end of the day, my state, was supposed to be a better state economically and otherwise than hers was, right? So I think the race and gender influence is critical because I think as Dr. Garner said, when you get to situations with single parent families or families where it's a grandparent who's serving the role of mother and father, it is very important that both the father and the mother are involved, right? Even if they're not together. So for the child to see them as role models, and for the child to see them as being really interested in their personal development, educationally and otherwise, is very critical. So where they're present, there's definitely a better outcome. They affect it positively. Where they're not, And one of the other things we have to remember, and I think it might have been in the question just before, how do you ensure that the parents are involved? We have to, and actually, Dr. Rogers, you spoke to that earlier in this question. We have to make sure that the parents are being facilitated in terms of when they can be reached by the school, right? So we have a lot of parents, we know that they're working towards their job because that's just a necessity, that's a requirement. Again, the pandemic makes that even more serious because they're going out, their health challenges. What are the times that the teacher can do FaceTime with them on Zoom or whatever? So it really takes that, I think Dr. Garner said, customized approach. So, these are some of the ways that the race and gender will influence the relationship between the parent, or parents get involved, and the ultimate educational success of that child.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate you for providing us current research and data and statistics, so our audience really understands where we are within the parental involvement and how significant it is within their child's educational success. So we're going to switch a little bit the context and go into something a bit more current. So the question that I have is, do you all think that the virtual school setting can help increase a parent's involvement in their child's academic success? I'll go ahead and start with Dr. Garner.
I'll just say really briefly that I think that this really depends, right? Um, this is. I'll just use one. Like I said, I know I'm on a panel with two other colleagues of mine. So my quick thinking on that is that let's just factor in economics, right? So if you're a parent whose schedule obviously doesn't free you up to be consistently attentive to the ever evolving needs of what is happening. And right now remote learning is still we're still working out the kinks, right? So this is requiring a level of patience, right? Like a whole bunch of dosages of patience, that parents will have to have. And if your work schedule doesn't permit you to be constantly on top of these ebbs and flows, then remote learning will not be, something. It will not be a viable option, for families. So that's one consideration that I want to put on the table.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Dr. Pinato Rogers, what are your thoughts?
I would agree with Dr. Garner that it's definitely up to the parent. If it really can take that road, because a lot of times it really depends on the parent. How much involved are you? How much involved can you be? During this time, if work doesn't permit and you're back in the office, now you're mostly on trying to find out what is my child actually learning and staying abreast. And I mean, definitely, I put it on some of the with the educators as well, sending those emails to parents, letting them know, how to, what's currently going on. So with virtual learning, it's almost, when you say, a catch-22 for us to look at it from that perspective, that it's a two-way street between our parents and our educators. If one doesn't make the actual, and then you do have a lot of our educators that do reach out by email and way of phone. But if a parent is not able to stay involved, it won't. The space could help, but it really won't work if neither one is actually trying to ensure that this child's academic success is ensured. So yeah, it can.
Okay,
I definitely
thank you.
agree with
And I
Dr.
see the
Garner.
audience definitely agrees with a lot of the content and the responses that you all have been providing this evening. Dr. Flanagan, what are your thoughts?
The irony is that at a time when the parental involvement and parental engagement is most needed, it's really the degree to which you're involved is a function of probably, as I think someone put on the chat, their socioeconomic status, right? So, do they have Wi-Fi? Can they afford computers, right? As Dr. Rogers said, what are the physical setting like? Are they all in 4 in 1 room, 4 in 2 rooms? Is a parent working? The parent not working? These are all the stressors that play into how much is virtual school can help increase or actually frustrate a parent, right? So and by extension, frustrate the educator. So I think the jury's out on this. One of the most recent reports I saw show that unlike other economic downturns, when people usually look to retrain and there was increased enrollment in college and higher education, like during the recession, and during this pandemic, there's actually been a drop off in college enrollment, and they said that students who are first in their families to pursue college degrees don't tend to take gap years to travel and intern. When they stop attending school, they rarely return, diminishing their job and wage prospects for the rest of their lives. So, this has very far-reaching implications for this generation and probably a couple more generations to come, at least.
Right. No, definitely. I agree with you all with regard to how you all answer that question. Well, this actually concludes our series today on parental involvement in educational success. I want to thank profoundly our panelists this evening who have really broken down the educational system and the parents' role within that. And before we go, I just want to give the audience an opportunity to connect with you all if they want to get more information with regard to how you each have discussed this topic. So with that being said, just providing a little bit of your contact information would be great. Dr. Parental Rogers, how can the audience get in contact with you?
I am on Instagram at she_is_blessed1128. And also via email. I'm also on email at info@blendedandblessed.com.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Garner, how about you? How can the audience get in contact with you?
Absolutely. You can contact me on Instagram at DC Garner, and I can also be reached via email at dcgarnerllc@gmail.com.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Flanagan, how can the audience get in contact with you?
So I look forward to being in touch with you, members of the audience. You can reach me at email, mflanagan, that's MFLANIGAN, and the number 1, mflanagan1 at mec.cuny.edu.
Okay, thank you. Again, I want to thank the panelists for taking some time out this evening to really educate our audience with regard to parental involvement. It's a hugely significant topic right now, being as we ended the conversation with regard to the virtual school setting that the educational system has now transitioned to. For the audience members who are interested in hearing more topics with regard to parental involvement, as well as other topics and research areas, please join our conference, which is taking place from October 29th to the 31st. And to do so, please register at the blackphdnetwork.org /2020 conference. Again, thank you, panelists, for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, moderator.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
You too.